at the subjective experience of a Stalinist political agent, leader, we see that it's not a position of an arrogant master who can do whatever he wants. It's, on the contrary, the position of a perfect servant. In the Stalinist universe, there definitely is what in psychoanalytic theory we call the big other. This big other in the Stalinist universe has many names. The best known of them are the necessity of historical progress towards communism, or simply history. History itself is the big other. History as the necessary succession of historical stages. A communist experiences himself as simply an instrument whose function is to actualize a historical necessity. The people, the mythic people, whose instrument the totalitarian leader is, are never simply the actually existing individuals, groups of people and so on. It's some kind of imagined, idealized point of reference which works even when, for example, in rebellions against the communist rule, like in Hungary, 56, when the large majority of actually resisting people raises up, is opposed to the regime. They can still say, no, these are just individuals, they are not the true people. When you are accused of, my God, how could you have been doing all these horrible things? You could have said, and this is the standard Stalinist excuse, of course, my heart bleeds for all the poor victims. I am not fully responsible for it, I was only acting on behalf of the big other. As for myself, I like cats, small children, whatever. This is always part of the iconography of a Stalinist leader. Lenin in Stalinism is always presented as someone who likes small children and cats. The implication being, Lenin had to order many killings and so on, but his heart was not there. This was his duty as instrument of historical progress and so on and so on. The way to undermine Stalinism is not simply to make fun of the leader. This can be up to a point even tolerated. It is to undermine this very reference, mythic reference, which legitimizes the Stalinist leader, the people. This is how I read the by far best work of Milos Forman, his early Czech films. Black Peter, The Loves of a Blonde, and Fireman's Ball, where he mocks precisely the ordinary people in their daily conformism, stupidity, egotistic lust, and so on and so on.
Eva, trošku života to, podívejte se, no, ergot. A
It may appear that this is something very arrogant, but no, I think that this is the way to undermine the entire structure of the Stalinist universe. To demonstrate not that leaders are not leaders. They are always ready to say, oh, but we are just ordinary people like you. No, that there is no mythic people which serves as the ultimate legitimization. So, what is the big other, this basic element of every ideological edifice? It has two quite contradictory aspects. On the one hand, of course, the big other is the secret order of things, like divine reason, fate, or whatever, which is controlling our destiny. But this is maybe the least interesting aspect of the big other, as the agency which guarantees meaning of what we are doing. Much more interesting is the big other as the order of appearances. Many things which are prohibited are not simply prohibited, but they should not happen for the big other. A supreme example of this agency of the big other as the agency of appearance is the prattling busybody in David Lean's masterpiece, The Brief Encounter. At the very beginning of the film, the two lovers, Celia Johnson and Trevor Howard, arranged for their last meeting in a cafeteria of a small train station.
Laura, what a lovely surprise.
Oh, darling.
My dear, I've been shopping till I'm dropping. My feet are nearly off, my throat's parched. I thought of having tea at Spindle's, but I was terrified of losing the train. Oh, dear.
Oh, this is Dr. Harvey.
How do you do? Would you be a perfect day and get me my cup of tea? I really don't think I could drag my poor old bones over to the counter.
Why is this situation so interesting? Because on the one hand, we cannot but experience this annoying lady as a brutal intruder.
There's your train.
Yes, I know.
Oh, aren't you coming with us?
No, I go in the opposite direction. My practice is in Shirley.
Oh, I see.
I'm a general practitioner at the moment.
Dr. Harvey's going out to Africa next week.
Oh, how thrilling.
Instead of the two lovers being allowed at least their final moments alone, they have to maintain the appearances that nothing is happening between them, that they are just acquaintances, and so on and so on.
He'll have to run or he'll miss it. He's got to get right over to the other platform.
This precisely is the function of the big other. We need for our stability a figure of big other for whom we maintain appearances.
And I arrived at the station with exactly half a minute to spare. My dear, I flew.
But are things really as simple as that? The next scene, the scene of Celia Johnson, totally desperate. She knows that she will never again see her lover.
Yes, he's a nice creature.
Have you known him long?
No, not very long. I hardly know him at all, really.
Well, my dear, I've always had a passion for doctors.
Then we hear the line of Celia Johnson's thought.
Wish I could trust you. I wish you were a wise, kind friend. Instead of a gossiping acquaintance I've known casually for years and never particularly cared for.
What is the nature of this deadlock of Celia Johnson? She is split between the two figures in the film of the big other. On the one hand, it's her husband, the ideal listener, but it's out of question to confess to him.
Fred. Dear Fred. There's so much that I want to say to you. You're the only one in the world with enough wisdom and gentleness to understand.
Wild horses wouldn't drag me away from England and home and all the things I'm used to. I mean, one has one's roots, after all, hasn't one?
Oh, yes, one has one's roots.
On the other hand, you have here the stupid person who is available as a confessor, but there is not even an elementary trust.
I wish you'd stop talking. I wish you'd stop prying and trying to find things out. I wish you were dead. No, I don't mean that. That was silly and unkind. But I wish you'd stop talking.
My dear, all her hair came out, and she said the social life was quite horrid. Provincial, you know, and very nouveau riche.
Oh, Dolly.
What's the matter, dear? Are you feeling ill again?
So that's the tragedy of our predicament. In order to fully exist as individuals, we need the fiction of a big other. There must be an agency which, as it were, registers our predicament, an agency where the truth of ourselves will be inscribed, accepted, an agency to which to confess. But what if there is no such agency? This was the utmost despair of many women raped in the post-Yugoslav war in Bosnia in the early 90s. They survived their terrible predicament, and what kept them alive was the idea, I must survive to tell the truth. If they survived, they made a terrible discovery. There is no one really to listen to them. Either some totally ignorant bored social worker or some relative who usually made obscene insinuations like, are you sure you were not even enjoying a little bit the rape, and so on and so on. They discovered the truth of what Jacques Lacan claims. There is no big other. There may be a virtual big other to whom you cannot confess. There may be a real other, but it's never the virtual one. We are alone. I think Kafka was right when he said that for a modern, secular, non-religious man, bureaucracy, state bureaucracy, is the only remaining contact with the